In the winter of 1887, deep in the unforgiving Absaroka range of Wyoming, a solitary hunter stumbled upon a sight that stopped him cold. It wasn't a grizzly, and it wasn't a wolf pack. It was a crumbling, abandoned shack that defied the laws of survival. But the shack wasn't empty. Inside, a woman was waging a silent war against the freezing death awaiting her. What this mountain man chose to do next wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a decision that would unravel a dark conspiracy trigger, a deadly standoff, and change the course of history in that valley forever. This is the true story of Caleb Mercer and the woman in the snow. The wind didn't just blow in the Wyoming territory. It hunted. It sought out the gaps in your coat, the cracks in your boots, and the weakness in your spirit. Caleb Mercer knew this wind better than any man alive. At 38 years old, Caleb was a relic of a time that was rapidly fading. He was a man of the high country, a tracker who had traded the chaotic noise of civilization for the brutal honesty of the mountains. It was November 14th, 1887. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low, threatening a storm that the old-timers would talk about for decades. Caleb was tracking a wounded elk, his breath pluming in the frigid air like dragon smoke. He moved with a silence that was unnatural for a man of his size, 6'3", broad-shouldered, clad in heavy bear fur and worn buckskin. He crested a ridge overlooking a narrow, boxed-in canyon, known to locals as Dead Man's Drop. It was a place usually avoided. The sun rarely touched the canyon floor, leaving it in perpetual twilight. That was when he saw it. A thin gray ribbon of smoke twisted up against the dark pines. Caleb frowned, his hand instinctively tightening around the walnut stock of his Winchester 1876. No one lived in Dead Man's Drop. The last man who tried a prospector named Old Josiah had been found frozen solid 3 years prior. Caleb abandoned the elk track. Curiosity in the high country was a dangerous thing, but instinct was a survival tool. He moved down the slope, his snowshoes crunching softly on the hard, packed crust. As he drew closer, the source of the smoke revealed itself, a cabin that looked more like a pile of driftwood than a home. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, the chinking between the logs had rotted away, and the door hung crooked on a single leather hinge. He crouched behind a boulder 200 yards out and pulled a brass spyglass from his pack. He adjusted the lens, expecting to see a drifter or perhaps an outlaw on the run. Instead, the glass revealed a woman. She was small, bundled in layers of rags that looked like shredded wool blankets. She was hacking at a frozen log with an axe that was far too heavy for her. Every swing was a labor of exhaustion. Caleb watched as she lifted the axe, her arms trembling violently, and brought it down. The blade bounced off the frozen wood. She dropped to her knees, burying her face in her hands. Caleb lowered the glass. This wasn't right. A woman alone 20 miles from the nearest settlement with a storm coming that could bury a house in 6 hours. It was a death sentence. He watched her for an hour. He needed to know if she was truly alone. Was there a man inside, a partner? But no one else emerged. The chimney smoke was thin and wispy. She was burning green wood, which meant she didn't know how to cure it, or she had run out of dry fuel. The temperature was dropping. The wind began to scream a high-pitched keen that signaled the arrival of the White Death. Caleb Mercer had a code. He didn't interfere with folks. He had left the world of men because it was full of lies and greed. But leaving a woman to freeze wasn't part of the code. He stood up, slung his rifle over his shoulder, and began the descent toward the cabin. He didn't know it then, but that first step toward the cabin was the end of his life as a ghost and the beginning of a war he hadn't asked for. The snow began to fall in earnest as Caleb reached the clearing. It wasn't drifting down. It was being driven sideways, stinging the skin like buckshot. He didn't sneak up. In the wild, surprising a desperate person was a good way to get shot. He walked heavily, letting his presence be known. "Hello, the house!" His voice boomed, cutting through the wind. The woman who had been struggling to gather kindling near the porch froze. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. She dropped the wood and scrambled backward toward the door, fumbling for something hidden in the folds of her rags. "Stay back!" she screamed. Her voice was cracked, dry, and brittle. Caleb stopped 10 yards away, raising his empty hands. "I ain't here to harm you, ma'am. Storm's coming. A bad one." "I have a gun," she warned, pulling a rusty revolver from her coat. It looked like an old Colt Navy, a relic from the Civil War. The barrel wavered, shaking uncontrollably in her grip. Caleb looked at the gun, then at her eyes. They were green, sharp, and terrified, set in a face gaunt from hunger. Her cheekbones looked like they might cut through her skin. "I see that," Caleb said calmly. "But unless you got dry wood and meat in that shack, that pistol won't stop the cold. And this storm, it's going to be a killer." She hesitated, glancing at the sky. The darkness was swallowing the valley. "Who sent you?" she demanded. "Did Holloway send you?" The name struck Caleb. Jubal Holloway. The wealthiest rancher in the territory. A man who owned the sheriff, the judge, and half the land between here and the Montana border. If Holloway was involved, this situation was far more dangerous than just bad weather. "I don't ride for Holloway," Caleb said, his voice hardening. "I don't ride for any man but myself. My name is Mercer. I was tracking elk." He reached slowly into his pack and pulled out a wrapped bundle of pemmican and dried venison. He tossed it gently. It landed in the snow at her feet. "Eat," he said. She stared at the food. The hunger won out over the fear. She snatched it up, tearing into the dried meat with a desperation that made Caleb's stomach turn. She hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. "Mom," Caleb said, stepping 1 foot closer. "Look at that roof. It won't hold under 2 feet of snow. And that door won't stop the wind. If I leave you here, you'll be dead by morning. That ain't a threat. That's the truth." She swallowed the food, clutching the rest to her chest. "Why do you care?" "I don't," Caleb lied. "But I won't have a ghost haunting my hunting grounds because I walked past." The wind gusted, ripping a shingle off the roof and sending it clattering into the darkness. The cold was biting through her rags now. She looked at the crumbling cabin, then at the giant of a man standing in the snow. "I have nothing to pay you," she whispered. "I didn't offer payment." Caleb grunted. "Now stand aside. I need to fix that door before the drift hits." She lowered the gun, stepping back. Caleb Mercer walked past her, ducking his head, to enter the gloom of the cabin. It smelled of mildew, old ash, and fear. It was the smell of a trap. He turned back to her. "What's your name, girl?" "Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Jenkins." "All right, Sarah Jenkins," Caleb said, dropping his heavy pack onto the dirt floor. "You keep that pistol close if it makes you feel safe, but right now, we got work to do." The storm raged for 3 days. Outside, the world was reduced to a howling white void. The wind battered the cabin with the force of a battering ram piling snow 6 feet high against the walls. But inside, for the first time in months, there was warmth. On that first night, Caleb had worked with a manic intensity. He had used a fallen pine to shore up the sagging roof beam. He had mixed mud and water from the melted snow to pack the worst of the gaps in the logs, freezing the mixture instantly to seal out the wind. He had stripped the leather from his own spare saddlebag to fix the door hinge. Now the fire roared in the hearth. Caleb had ventured out into the teeth of the storm twice to drag in deadfall timber, chopping it with effortless power, while Sarah watched from the corner wrapped in his extra bear fur blanket. They barely spoke for the first 2 days. The sound of the wind was too loud, and the suspicion in the room was too heavy. Sarah slept with the rusty revolver under her hand. Caleb slept sitting up against the wall, his Winchester across his lap, one eye always half open. By the third morning, the wind died down. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the mountain. Caleb was skinning a rabbit he had snared before the storm hit. Sarah sat by the fire, the color slowly returning to her face. She looked different now, cleaner, though still frail. "You said you don't ride for Halloway," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was stronger now. Caleb didn't look up from his knife work. "I don't." "He's looking for me," she said. "I figured," Caleb replied. "A woman like you doesn't hide in a rot box like this unless she's running from the law or the devil. Jubal Halloway is a bit of both." Sarah pulled her knees to her chest. "I was his bookkeeper. For the ranch. For the mining operations." Caleb paused. A bookkeeper. That was dangerous. A bookkeeper knew where the money came from, and more importantly, where it went. "I saw the ledgers," she continued, the words tumbling out, as if she had been holding them in for years. "Halloway isn't just buying land, Mr. Mercer. He's stealing it. He hires men to burn out the homesteaders. If they don't sell, they die. I found the payroll, the list of names, hired guns, sheriff deputies, even a judge in Cheyenne." Caleb looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You got proof?" Sarah reached into her boot and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. It was battered and water-stained. "I stole it. I ran the night he found out I knew. His son, Tobias Halloway. He chased me. I lost my horse crossing the river. I've been here for 3 weeks. Caleb wiped his knife on his pant leg and sheathed it. He knew Tobias. He was a cruel, vain man who enjoyed pain. If Tobias was tracking her, he wouldn't stop until he had her, or until the snow melted enough to bring the dogs. "You know what this is?" Caleb pointed to the book. "That's a death warrant." "It's the truth," Sarah countered defiantly. "Truth don't stop a bullet," Caleb said. He stood up and walked to the small, grimy window. The snow was piled high, but the sky was clearing. A bright, hard blue was breaking through. "The storms broke," Caleb said. "That means the passes will be clear in a day or 2. "Are you going to leave?" Sarah asked. Her voice trembled just a little. Caleb looked at the vast white wilderness. He could leave. He could strap on his snowshoes, walk away, and disappear back into the high country. He could live his solitary life, hunting elk and sleeping under the stars, safe from the corruption of men like Jubal Halloway. He looked back at Sarah. She was terrified, but she was holding her chin high. She had survived alone in this hell for 3 weeks. She had guts. "No," Caleb said. "I ain't leaving." "Then what are we going to do?" Caleb turned to her, a grin set to his jaw. "Halloway thinks you're dead, frozen in the storm. We're going to let him think that. But come spring or sooner, Tobias will come looking for bones. We need to be ready." "Ready to run?" "No," Caleb said, walking over to the fireplace and throwing another log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. "I'm done running. We're going to turn this shack into a fortress. And when they come, we're going to make them wish they froze in the storm." He looked around the dismal room. "But first we need to fix this place up. A person can't fight a war if they're freezing to death." What happened over the next few weeks was the part of the story that the locals still whisper about. It wasn't the shooting, not yet. It was the transformation. Caleb Mercer didn't just patch the cabin. He went to work with a fury that amazed Sarah. He was about to show her what a mountain man could do with an axe, a knife, and the will to survive. If the storm was the hammer, the weeks that followed were the anvil. The Absaroka winter settled in with a bone-crushing weight. The snow didn't melt. It hardened into a shell of ice that covered the valley floor. But inside the canyon of Dead Man's Drop, something miraculous was happening. Caleb Mercer was a man who spoke the language of wood and stone. He looked at the rotting hovel and saw potential where Sarah saw only a coffin. "First things first," Caleb announced, the morning the sky cleared. "The wind is the enemy. It steals the heat faster than the fire can make it." He didn't just patch the walls, he insulated them. He took his axe to the dense thicket of spruce trees near the creek. He cut boughs, hundreds of them. He showed Sarah how to weave them into thick mats. They nailed these mats to the exterior of the logs, layering them like shingles. Then Caleb packed snow over the boughs. "Snow is air," he explained, his breath steaming. "Trapped air keeps the cold out. It's how the grouse survive. It's how we survive." Within 2 days, the cabin looked like a snow cave, a white mound indistinguishable from the drifts around it. But inside the temperature rose. It wasn't hot, but the biting edge was gone. Next came the food. The pemmican was running low. Caleb took Sarah to the edge of the clearing. He didn't give her a rifle yet. He gave her a lesson. "You look for the lines that don't belong," he whispered, pointing at a patch of brush. "Nature is chaotic. Animals make patterns." He taught her to set snares using the wire from an old bucket handle found in the shed. He showed her how to smoke the meat of the snowshoe hares they caught hanging strips of flesh from the rafters near the chimney, until the cabin smelled of hickory and wild game. But the true amazement came from Caleb's ingenuity. He found a rusted iron stove in the collapsed shed, nearby a heavy, useless thing with a missing leg. He dragged it inside, propped it up on stones, and rerouted the chimney pipe. He created a drying rack above it. He carved wooden bowls and spoons from birch knots because they had no dishes. He even fashioned a crude pair of snowshoes for Sarah out of ash wood and rawhide strips cut from his own spare buckskins. As they worked, the wall between them began to thaw. Sarah wasn't just a damsel in distress. She had a sharp mind. She organized their supplies with the precision of the bookkeeper she was. She rationed the coffee grounds, Caleb's one luxury, making them last weeks longer than he would have. She mended his torn bear fur coat with a needle made from a sharpened rabbit bone and thread pulled from the hem of her skirt. One evening, as the fire crackled in the restored stove, Caleb sat whittling a trigger mechanism for a deadfall trap. Sarah was reading the stolen ledger, her brow furrowed. "You got family Mercer?" she asked, not looking up. Caleb's knife paused. "Had a wife once, Mary, and a boy." Sarah looked up, sensing the heavy shift in the air. "What happened?" "Cholera. Back in 78. Took 'em both in 3 days." Caleb stared into the fire, his eyes seeing ghosts. "I couldn't save 'em. A man can fight a bear, he can fight a storm. But sickness, it just walks in and takes what it wants. I burned the house down after they passed, walked into the mountains, and didn't look back. It was the most he had spoken in days. Sarah reached out, placing a hand on his rough, scarred forearm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be." Caleb grunted, though he didn't pull away. "Pain is just a reminder you're still alive." He looked at her, then really looked at her. The gauntness was leaving her face. Her green eyes were clear and fierce. She was beautiful in a wild, hardened way. "What about you?" Caleb asked. "A girl like you messing with Halloway's books. You must have had a reason to be snooping." "My father," Sarah said, her voice hardening. "He was one of the homesteaders Halloway burned out. He died of a heart attack watching our barn go up in flames. The law said it was an accident. I knew it wasn't. I took the job at the ranch to find the proof. I didn't care if I died doing it." Caleb nodded slowly. They were two wounded animals healing in the dark. A bond was forming, forged in survival, tempered by shared loss. It wasn't a romance of flowers and poetry. It was a romance of shared warmth in a freezing world of trust built one log, one meal, one day at a time. But peace in the Wild West was a fragile thing. It was late December when the peace broke. Caleb was outside chopping wood. The sound of the axe, thwack, 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 echoed off the canyon walls. It was a rhythmic, comforting sound. Until it wasn't. Caleb stopped mid-swing. The birds had gone silent. The squirrels, which had been chattering in the pines, were gone. He lowered the axe slowly. He scanned the ridgeline. Nothing moved, but the hair on the back of his neck, the instinct that had kept him alive for 20 years in the mountains, was screaming. "We are being watched." He didn't run. He bent down, picked up an armload of wood, and walked casually back to the cabin. As soon as the door latched behind him, he dropped the wood and grabbed his Winchester. "Get down," he hissed to Sarah. "Away from the window." "What is it?" she asked, seeing the change in his eyes, the warmth gone replaced by the cold predator. "Company." The shot cracked through the silent air like a whip. A bullet smashed into the door frame, sending splinters flying into the room. Sarah screamed and dropped to the floor, covering her head. Caleb was already moving, sliding to the side of the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. "High ground," Caleb muttered. "East Ridge, 300 yards. He saw the puff of smoke against the grey rock. A Sharp's rifle. Long range. A professional's gun. "Is it Tobias?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling, but her hand gripping the Colt Navy he had taught her to clean. "Not yet," Caleb said. "Scouts, hired guns, probably tracking the smoke." Another shot punched through the window, shattering the glass Caleb had carefully cleaned. The bullet buried itself in the far wall, inches from the stove. Caleb didn't return fire. Not yet. He waited. He needed to know how many. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then movement. 3 men emerged from the tree line, moving cautiously. They were dressed in heavy dusters, scarves pulled up over their faces. They moved like men who were confident they had cornered a rat. They didn't know they had cornered a grizzly. "Stay here," Caleb commanded. "If anyone comes through that door, that ain't me, you empty that gun into them." "Where are you going?" Sarah cried, reaching for him. "I'm going to introduce myself." Caleb slipped out the back. He had built a small escape hatch in the rear foundation, hidden by a pile of firewood, specifically for this moment. He belly crawled through the snow hidden by the trench he had dug to the outhouse. He moved fast, circling wide into the timber. The 3 men were advancing on the cabin, guns raised. They were shouting now. "Come on out, girl. We know you're in there." Mr. Holloway just wants his property back." One of the men laughed, a cruel, jagged sound. "And maybe we get a little warmth before we ride back. Huh?" Caleb was 50 yards to their left, hidden behind a fallen spruce. He steadied his Winchester on a branch. He took a breath, letting it out slowly, his heart rate dropping to a steady thrum. He squeezed the trigger. The lead man, the one who had laughed, jerked violently as the .45-75 slug slammed into his shoulder. He spun around and collapsed into the snow, screaming. The other two scattered, diving for cover behind the few tree stumps in the clearing. "Who the hell is that?" one yelled. "I don't know, I can't see him." Caleb levered the rifle. Clack, clack. He fired again, the bullet kicking up snow inches from the second man's head. "Next one takes your ear off." Caleb's voice boomed from the trees, sounding like it came from everywhere and nowhere. "Drop the guns now." The men hesitated. They were hired thugs, used to bullying farmers and shopkeepers. They weren't ready for a ghost in the woods. "We got authorization from the sheriff," one shouted back, though his voice wavered. "The sheriff ain't here," Caleb roared. "But I am. You have 10 seconds to drop the iron and drag your friend out of here, or I leave you for the wolves." The wounded man was wailing, the snow around him turning crimson. The other two looked at each other, then at the dark, menacing tree line. They threw their rifles into the snow. All right, don't shoot." Caleb emerged from the trees. His rifle shouldered his face, a mask of fury. He walked toward them, tall and terrifying. He kicked their rifles away. He looked down at the wounded man. The shot wasn't fatal, but it would hurt like hell. "You tell Jubal Holloway," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous, "that Sarah Jenkins is under the protection of Caleb Mercer. You tell him if he sends men here again, I won't shoot for the shoulder. I'll shoot for the soul." He gestured with the barrel of his gun. "Git!" The two men dragged their bleeding comrade to their horses, which were tied at the edge of the clearing. They scrambled into their saddles and rode hard, kicking up plumes of snow, not looking back. Caleb watched them go until they disappeared over the ridge. He didn't relax. He knew what this meant. This wasn't a victory. It was an escalation. He walked back to the cabin. Sarah was standing in the doorway, the Colt in her hand, her face pale. She saw the blood in the snow. "Did you kill them?" she asked. "No," Caleb said, picking up the discarded rifles. He inspected them, good repeaters. Useful. Sent 'em back with a message. He walked inside and started packing his kit. "What message?" Sarah asked, following him. "That we're here," Caleb said. He looked at her, his eyes full of a grim apology. "I made a mistake, Sarah. I let them go." "Why is that a mistake? You showed mercy." "Mercy to a wolf just means he comes back with the pack," Caleb said. He slammed a box of ammunition onto the table. "They know where we are now, and they know I'm here. Holloway won't send 3 drunks next time. He'll send Tobias, and Tobias will bring an army." Sarah felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter. "So we run too deep in winter. We'd freeze before we made the pass." Caleb shook his head. "We stand our ground, but we need to change the odds." Caleb went to the corner of the room and pulled up a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a wooden crate he had buried there years ago, one of his many caches in the mountains. He pried the lid open. Inside lay sticks of dynamite, leftover from his days working the silver mines in Colorado. He looked at Sarah. "You ever light a fuse, Sarah?" "No," she whispered. "Well," Caleb said, a dark, humorless smile touching his lips. You're about to learn. Because when Tobias Halloway comes up that canyon, I'm going to bring the mountain down on top of him." The sun set over Dead Man's Drop, bathing the snow in a blood-red light. The siege had begun. The waiting was always worse than the dying. Caleb knew this from the war, and he knew it from the hunt. 3 days had passed since the scouts had fled, bleeding into the timber. The valley of Dead Man's Drop had returned to its eerie silence, but the air felt heavy, charged with a violence that hadn't yet arrived. Caleb and Sarah had not wasted a second. They turned the cabin into a kill box. The windows were boarded up, leaving only narrow firing slits. The table was overturned and reinforced with sandbags filled with frozen earth. Outside, Caleb had rigged the dynamite. He hadn't just placed it randomly. He had climbed the high ridges flanking the canyon, placing charges at key stress points in the snowpack. He ran the fuses down through the trees, hiding them under the snow, all leading back to a single plunger, hidden behind a rock formation, 50 yards from the cabin. On the night of January 4th, 1888, the moon was full, casting a pale, ghostly light over the snow. Sarah sat by the stove, cleaning the Winchester. Her hands, once soft and ink-stained, were now calloused and steady. "They'll come at dawn," Caleb said, looking out the slit. "Tobias is arrogant. He'll want us to see him coming. He'll want the fear to do the work before the bullets do." "I'm not afraid," Sarah said. She looked up, and Caleb saw that she was telling the truth. The terrified girl he had found hacking at a log was gone. In her place was a woman forged in iron. "I'm angry." Caleb walked over and knelt beside her. He took a heavy iron key from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "If the line breaks," he said, his voice rough, "you take the back tunnel. You run for the pass. There's a cash box at the tree line with snowshoes and a map. This key opens a safe deposit box in the bank at Laramie. It's got enough gold to get you to California." Sarah closed her fingers over the key, then grabbed his hand. "I'm not going to California, Caleb. I'm staying right here." He started to argue, but she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was desperate and fierce, tasting of coffee and wood smoke. It was a claim. "We fight together," she whispered against his lips. Dawn broke with the sound of thunder, but there was no storm. It was the sound of 40 horses. They came up the canyon floor in a wedge formation, a dark stain on the pristine white. At the lead rode Tobias Halloway. He wore a long buffalo hide coat and a hat banded with silver. He looked like a prince of the plains, confident and cruel. Behind him rode hired guns, hard men, from the darker corners of the territory, men who killed for coin. They stopped 200 yards out. Tobias rode forward, his horse prancing in the deep snow. "Mercer!" Tobias shouted, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. "You're a hard man to kill. I respect that. Send out the girl and the book, and I'll let you walk away. I'll even give all. Give all to so you who are so simple." Inside the cabin, Caleb sighted down the barrel of his 1876 Winchester. "He's lying," Caleb muttered. "I know," Sarah replied, leveling her Colt through the second firing port. "Mercer!" Tobias yelled again. "Don't be a fool. You're one man against a battalion. You can't win." Caleb didn't answer with words. He answered with a 350-grain bullet. He aimed not at Tobias, that was too easy, and his men would just charge, but at the ground in front of Tobias's horse. The bullet kicked up a massive spray of ice. The horse reared, nearly throwing the land baron's son. "That's my answer," Caleb roared. "Kill them!" Tobias screamed, his face twisting in rage. "Burn it to the ground! Leave nothing but ash!" The valley erupted. 40 rifles opened fire at once. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar like a waterfall of explosions. The cabin splintered under the hail of lead. Wood chips flew like confetti. Bullets punched through the logs, whizzing past Caleb and Sarah's heads. "Keep low!" Caleb yelled, firing back. He worked the lever of his rifle with a rhythmic, deadly precision. Bang! Clack, clack. Bang! Out in the snow, a rider fell, then another. But there were too many of them. They were advancing, moving from tree to tree, closing the noose. "They're flanking us," Sarah shouted. She fired her revolver, forcing a man in a duster to dive behind a stump. "I have to get to the plunger." Caleb gritted his teeth. The detonator for the dynamite was outside behind the rock. He had hoped to trigger it before the firefight got this close, but the riders had spread out too fast. "You'll get cut to ribbons," Sarah cried. "Cover me!" Caleb kicked open the back escape hatch. He didn't crawl this time. He sprinted. He burst out of the snow-covered tunnel and dove toward the rock formation. The gunman saw him. "There he is! Get him!" Bullets chewed up the snow around his boots. One grappled his sleeve, tearing the fur but missing the flesh. Another grazed his thigh, a hot poker of pain. He hit the ground behind the granite slab, his chest heaving. He reached for the plunger. The wire was severed. A stray bullet had cut the main fuse line just feet from the detonator. The dynamite on the ridges, the charges meant to bring down the avalanche, were useless. Caleb stared at the cut wire in horror. He looked back at the cabin. The men were close now, throwing torches onto the porch. The dry pine boughs he had used for insulation were catching fire. "Burn them out!" Tobias was laughing, watching from safety. Caleb looked up at the towering, snow-laden cliffs above the canyon. Thousands of tons of snow hanging by a thread. He looked at his rifle. He looked at the distance. It was impossible. A shot to the dynamite pack from here was a 1 in a million prayer. He stood up. He stepped out from behind the rock, exposing himself to the fire. "Hey!" he screamed, drawing every eye, every gun toward him. "Tobias!" The shooting slowed for a second as the gunmen looked at the crazy mountain man standing in the open. Caleb didn't aim at them. He raised his Winchester toward the heavens, aiming at a small red bundle strapped to a dead tree high on the cliff face the master charge. "Look up!" Caleb roared. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil hit his shoulder. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a small puff of grey smoke bloomed on the cliff face. A second later, a crack echoed across the valley, sharper than thunder. The dynamite detonated. The explosion wasn't the scary part. The scary part was the groan. The entire mountain seemed to sigh. A crack appeared in the snowfield, running a mile long. Then the white curtain began to fall. "Avalanche!" one of the gunmen screamed. Panic seized the attackers. Horses panicked, throwing their riders. Men scrambled, trying to turn their mounts in the deep snow. But it was too late. The roar became a physical weight, vibrating in their chests. A wall of white, 50 feet high, was cascading down the canyon walls, moving faster than a train. Caleb didn't run. He dove back toward the cabin's tunnel. He scrambled inside just as the world turned white. The cabin shook. The roof groaned under a sudden crushing impact. Darkness swallowed them. The roar was apocalyptic, burying the screams of Tobias Halloway and his private army. Then silence. absolute, suffocating silence. The world did not end with a bang, but with a groan. The sound of the avalanche was a physical thing, a vibration that rattled the teeth in Caleb's skull, even as he dove through the narrow trapdoor of the cabin. He hit the dirt floor hard, scrambling on hands and knees as the roar outside reached a crescendo that sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart. Then the impact came. It wasn't a sharp strike. It was a crushing, suffocating weight. The cabin, reinforced with green timber and sheer desperation, screamed under the load. The massive ridge beam Caleb had shored up months ago bowed dangerously, emitting a sound like a gunshot. Crack! But it did not break. The windows, already boarded, blew inward instantly, plugged by a wall of concrete-hard snow. The lantern on the table was extinguished by the shock wave of air pressure. Then absolute, terrifying silence. Caleb lay in the darkness, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The air was instantly thick with dust from the disturbed floor and the smell of ancient soot shaken from the stovepipe. "Sarah." His voice sounded flat, deadened by the immense insulation of snow surrounding them. There was no echo. "Sarah," he called again, panic fluttering in his chest for the first time in 20 years. I'm here." Her voice came from near the stove. It was small, trembling, but alive. Caleb fumbled in his pocket for his tin of lucifer matches. His fingers were numb, shaking from the adrenaline dump. He struck one against the rough sole of his boot. The flare of sulfur was blinding in the pitch black. The brief yellow light revealed a scene of claustrophobic horror. The cabin had shrunk. The roof had sagged a full foot in the center. The walls were bowing inward. But the most terrifying detail was the silence. The wind which had howled through the canyon for months was gone. The world outside didn't exist anymore. They were entombed. Caleb crawled over to Sarah. She was huddled against the iron legs of the stove, clutching the Colt Navy to her chest as if the gun could shoot back the crushing weight of the mountain. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes all and luminous in the matchlight. "Did we get them?" she whispered. "The mountain got them," Caleb said, his voice grim. He helped her to her feet. "But it might have got us, too." The match burned down to his fingers, and he shook it out, plunging them back into darkness. He lit another, moving to the oil lamp on the floor. He managed to get a flicker of flame going, turning the wick down low to conserve fuel. "How deep?" Sarah asked, looking at the boarded window where snow was squeezing through the cracks like white putty. "Deep," Caleb estimated. "That was a shelf collapse. We could be under 10 feet. We could be under 50. The reality of their situation settled over them like a shroud. They had heat, the stove was still warm. They had a little food, but they had limited air. The cabin wasn't airtight, but under tons of packed snow, the oxygen exchange would be slow. Carbon dioxide would build up. They would just go to sleep and never wake up. "We have to dig," Sarah said, grabbing the shovel from the corner. "Not yet." Caleb stopped her, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "If we open the door, the snow comes in. It fills the room in seconds. We'll be crushed." He looked up at the ceiling at the stovepipe that disappeared through the roof. It was their lifeline. "The heat," Caleb said, his mind working through the problem with the cold logic of an engineer. "We stoke the fire. Hot air rises. It'll melt a cavity around the pipe. We clear the pipe from the inside, let the smoke melt a chimney up through the drift." For the next 48 hours, time lost all meaning. There was no day or night, only the rhythmic scraping of metal and the hiss of melting ice. They worked in shifts. Caleb disassembled the lower section of the stovepipe. He stood on the table using a long iron poker to stab upward into the blockage. It was grueling work. The snow packed into the pipe had turned to ice. He had to chip away at it, shards falling into his face, melting into his beard. Sarah kept the fire raging. She burned the furniture. She burned the shelves. She burned the very boards of the floor. The heat in the small buried box became sweltering, a tropical hell deep beneath the freezing snow. They stripped down to their undershirts, sweating, gasping for air that felt thinner by the hour. I can't breathe," Sarah gasped around the 20-hour mark, slumping against the wall. The carbon monoxide was rising. "Stay with me, Sarah," Caleb rasped. He was dizzy, his vision tunneling. "Just a little more." He was losing hope. The poker was hitting something hard, a tree trunk, perhaps, or a boulder brought down by the slide. If the chimney was blocked by rock, they were dead. He roared in frustration, a guttural sound of pure defiance, and thrust the poker upward with every ounce of strength remaining in his massive shoulders. Clang! The obstruction shifted. A sudden rush of cold air blasted down the pipe, carrying with it a shower of slush. It was the sweetest thing Caleb had ever felt. "Draft," he choked out. "We got a draft." The smoke sucked upward with a roar. The fire breathed. They breathed, but the work wasn't done. Now they had to tunnel. Caleb widened the hole around the chimney, hacking at the ice ceiling. He climbed up onto the roof of the cabin, standing in a small melted cavern of blue ice. He began to dig upward, packing the displaced snow behind him, creating a staircase of slush. It took another day, a day of freezing wet misery, of fingers bleeding, of muscles cramping until they locked. On the morning of January 7th, Caleb's shovel hit nothing. He thrust it up again. Blue. Not blue ice, blue sky. He widened the hole and pulled himself up. He lay on the surface of the snow, gasping, the sunlight searing his eyes. He reached back down. "Take my hand." He pulled Sarah up beside him. They collapsed onto the hard-packed crust of the avalanche debris, holding on to each other, weeping without tears. When they finally sat up and looked at the valley, they fell silent. Dead Man's Drop was gone. The V-shaped canyon had been filled in, turned into a flat white plain. The tree line where the gunmen had hidden was erased. Millions of tons of snow had scoured the earth clean. "Where are they?" Sarah whispered, looking for any sign of Tobias Halloway and his private army. Caleb pointed to a splash of color half a mile down the slope. It was a red saddle blanket, fluttering from the jagged stump of a pine tree that stuck out of the snow like a tombstone. "Gone," Caleb said. "Buried deep. They won't be found until the spring thaw. Maybe not even then." The war was over, but the survival was just beginning. They had no horses, no snowshoes lost in the cache or buried. No heavy coats. Caleb's bear fur was ruined, shredded in the escape. They had the clothes on their backs, a handful of jerky, and a relentless will to live. "South Pass City is 40 miles, Caleb said, shielding his eyes against the glare. "In deep snow, without gear." Sarah stood up. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the biting wind. She looked at Caleb, her jaw set in that stubborn line he had come to love. "Then we better start walking." The journey out of the Absaroka Range became a local legend in itself. It was a march of misery. They post-holed through thigh-deep drifts where the avalanche hadn't reached. They slept in tree wells, huddled together for warmth, burying themselves in pine needles. On the second night, a pack of timber wolves trailed them, sensing their weakness. Their eyes glowed yellow in the darkness beyond the small fire Caleb managed to start. Caleb had only 3 rounds left in his revolver. He sat up all night, the gun heavy in his frost-bitten hand. He didn't shoot. He growled back at them. He was the apex predator here, and the wolves, sensing the sheer lethality radiating from the starving man, turned tail and vanished into the timber at dawn. By the 4th day, Sarah couldn't walk. Her boots were worn through. Her feet were blocks of ice. Caleb didn't leave her. He didn't even slow down. He picked her up. He carried her. For 10 miles, the mountain man carried the bookkeeper. He moved like a machine, putting one foot in front of the other, hallucinating ghosts in the trees. He spoke to her constantly, telling her stories of his youth, of the ocean he had never seen, of the house they would build. He kept her awake. He kept her alive. When they stumbled onto the main road leading into the mining camp of South Pass City, they looked like revenants rising from the grave. Caleb was gaunt, his beard matted with ice, his eyes sunken. Sarah was unconscious in his arms. A miner leading a mule team saw them and dropped his reins in shock. "God Almighty," the miner whispered. Is that a man?" Caleb stopped. He swayed. He looked at the miner with burning eyes. "Water," he croaked. "And a telegraph." They were taken to the boarding house. The town doctor, a drunkard named Doc Miller, who sobered up fast when he saw the frostbite, worked on them for hours. He managed to save Sarah's toes, though it was a near thing. While Sarah slept, Caleb sat in the lobby of the boarding house, wrapped in blankets, refusing to rest. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Send it," he told the telegraph operator. "To Cheyenne, Marshal T.J. Carr. Tell him Caleb Mercer has the ledger." The arrival of U.S. Marshal T.J. Carr was a spectacle. He rode in with 4 deputies men with badges and Winchesters. They didn't come for Caleb. They came for the evidence. When Sarah woke up 2 days later, the marshal was sitting by her bed, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," the marshal said, his voice gravelly but respectful. "Your young man outside. He says you have a book that can hang a king." Sarah reached into the tattered remains of her dress, which had been hung on the chair. She pulled out the water-stained, leather-bound journal. She handed it to the lawman. "Not a king, Marshal," Sarah said, her voice weak but steady. "Just a thief." The fall of the Holloway Empire was swift and brutal. With Tobias dead under the snow and the ledger in federal hands, the web of corruption unraveled. Jubal Holloway, the man who believed he owned the Wyoming Territory, was arrested in his mansion while eating a steak dinner. He screamed threats, he bribed, he pleaded. But the ledger had names, dates, and payoffs. It was irrefutable. Jubal was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary at Laramie. He died 3 years later of pneumonia, a broken, forgotten man. But for Caleb and Sarah, the end of the violence was just the beginning of the life. They didn't stay in South Pass City. The town was too loud, too full of curious eyes wanting to see the Avalanche couple. Caleb took the reward money, a substantial sum posted by the railroad companies that Holloway had been defrauding, and bought a deed. He didn't return to the high peaks. He had made his peace with the mountains, but he was done with the solitude. He bought 300 acres in the Wind River Valley, a place where the grass grew tall and the winters were forgiving. They built a house. It wasn't a shack. Caleb built it with the same precision he had used to fortress the cabin, but this time he built it for light. He built a wraparound porch where a person could sit and watch the sun dip behind the mountains, without fearing what the dark would bring. They were married in the spring of 1889. It was a small ceremony. No church, just a circuit judge standing in their field with the wind rippling the grass. Sarah wore a dress of blue silk, ordered all the way from St. Louis. Caleb wore a suit, though he looked uncomfortable in it, constantly tugging at the collar. But when he looked at Sarah, the hardness that had defined his face for so long melted away. They had 3 children, 2 boys, Jacob and Elias, and a daughter Mary, named after the memory Caleb had finally laid to rest. Caleb Mercer lived to be 74 years old. He became a legend in the valley, not as a gunman, but as a man who could fix anything, a man who knew the weather before the clouds arrived. He taught his sons to hunt, to track, and to respect the wild. But he never let them go up to Dead Man's Drop. Sarah became the backbone of the community. She used her education to open the valley's first real school. She served on the town council, a woman in a man's world, commanding respect with a single look from her fierce green eyes. She never carried a gun again, but every man in the county knew she could hit a silver dollar at 50 paces. There is a story passed down through the Mercer family about the last winter of Caleb's life. It was 1923. Caleb was old, his joints stiff from a lifetime of hard labor and old injuries. He was sitting on the porch, a blanket over his legs, watching a storm roll in over the Absaroka Range. The clouds were dark, bruising the sky, just like they had been on that day in 1887. Sarah came out with 2 mugs of coffee. Her hair was white now, but her back was straight. She sat beside him, taking his hand. His knuckles were swollen, the scars from the frostbite, and the bullets still visible. "Looks like a bad one," Sarah said, looking at the storm. "It's just wind." Caleb rumbled his voice, a shadow of the boom it once was. He squeezed her hand. "You ever think about it, Sarah? If I hadn't looked down that canyon, if I'd just kept tracking that elk?" Sarah looked at him. She thought about the cold, the hunger, the terror of the cabin. Then she thought about the children asleep inside the warmth of the house, the 40 years of love they had stolen from a world that wanted to kill them. "No," Sarah said softly. "I never think about that. Because you were always going to look Caleb. That's who you are." Caleb smiled, closing his eyes. "I suppose so." He died in his sleep that night, the storm raging outside, safe and warm, in the house he built beside the woman he saved. Sarah followed him 2 years later. They are buried side by side in the small family plot on the ranch. The headstones are simple granite. On Caleb's it says, "Guardian of the Valley." On Sarah's it says, "The Heart of the Home." But if you look closely at the base of the stones, there is an inscription carved into the rock connecting them. It's a line from the journal Sarah kept during those long, dark nights under the snow, a testament to the miracle of their survival. Love is the only fire that winter cannot kill. And that is the true story of the mountain man and the bookkeeper. It is a story that reminds us that destiny isn't written in the stars. It's written in the choices we make when the storm hits. It's about the strength to hold the door shut against the wind and the courage to open it when love knocks. Thank you for journeying into the past with me. If this story warmed your spirit, please like this video and share it with a friend who needs a reminder that spring always follows winter. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you're the first to hear the next tale from the untamed frontier. Until next time, stay wild. That, my friends, is the legend of Caleb and Sarah. It's a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest corners of the world, warmth can be found, and that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply refuse to leave someone behind. If this story moved you, or if you believe in the kind of loyalty that can move mountains, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten tales with the world. Share this video with someone who loves a true Western romance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story from the frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires burning.